I was on the flight between Philadelphia and Berkeley with Srila Prabhupada when the captain of the jet came out of the cockpit. He sat down next to Prabhupada, and the two of them had a very animated, joyful discussion. You can see Prabhupada was relishing the conversation. So I was filming this, and I was curious what they were discussing, but of course I couldn't hear it, and I was too shy to ask Prabhupada, what did you talk about after it was over? So I resigned myself that I guess I wouldn't know. But it turned out that when Prabhupada arrived in Berkeley, during his arrival address, he mentioned the conversation. And he said the captain was very intelligent, and he asked several questions. One of the questions was, if God is all good, then why is there evil in the world? And Prabhupada said, for God, there is no evil. There's only good. And he gave the analogy, just as my back is as important to me as my chest. If there's pain in my back, I take care of that. I don't ignore it, thinking that the chest is more important. So evil is like the back of God, and it's not different from his front, which is compared to goodness. And then the captain asked, if everything is good from God's point of view, how can there be evil? And Prabhupada gave another example. He said it's like the sun. On the body of the sun, there's no shadow. We create shadow by turning our back to the sun. So similarly, evil means when we turn away from God. So then the captain asked a third question. He said, how is it possible to attain peace? And Prabhupada said, to attain peace, we have to understand that God is the supreme proprietor, the supreme enjoyer, and the supreme friend.
There was another time with captains and airplanes also I can tell you about. We were between Bombay and Calcutta, and the pilot invited us in to the cabin. And even when we landed, we stayed there. We didn't even have seatbelts on, anything. We just flew right into Calcutta. The pilot was showing everything to Prabhupada about the controls and how he flew the plane. And then Prabhupada turned to me and he said, it's just like typing. After a while, you learn how to move your fingers, because the pilot was going this and that and moving his fingers everywhere and switching switches. Because they switch switches a lot up there. They're not just sitting there. They're really doing things. And he was watching them and turned to me and said, you can learn how to fly. I said, me fly? I'm afraid of heights.
I had attended the University of California here at Berkeley in the early 60s. And I remember there's so much anxiety with student rebellions and riots, and the drug scene was exploding at the time. And most students, including myself, were just dissatisfied and bewildered. Regularly, students were committing suicide by jumping off the clock tower we see in the background. When Srila Prabhupada was informed about this, his response put my whole university experience into perspective. And he told the story of the Himalayas giving birth. So many people gathered at a cave at the base of these huge mountains and then waited for days. And finally the mountains rumbled, and the people only saw some rats run out of the cave. Everyone laughed, and then Bahulasva told Prabhupada that I had graduated from this university. And Brahmananda said, oh, poor Yadubara. And I stepped forward and said, yes, Srila Prabhupada, I am one of those rats.
I joined the Los Angeles Temple in 1975. And the day that I joined, they put seemed like about 100 devotees on the back of a flatbed truck covered with a tarp. And we all drove to San Francisco for Rath Yatra. I was new bhakt. I wasn't shaved up yet. I had long hair and a beard. I didn't really know much at all. So we were engaged helping to set up the festival, and we slept under the stage, the main stage. And the next day in the morning, we drove over to the Berkeley Temple for greeting of the deities. And Prabhupada came out around that same time, and all the devotees just pay their obeisances. And remember the first time I saw Srila Prabhupada, when he came out, it was just, I guess a lot of devotees have said this, but it was really like the room just lit up from his presence, although he was pretty slight in stature. But just this amazing effulgence came from him. And I remember thinking, boy, this person is really powerful. And then I thought, I hope he's good, because anyone with that kind of potency, it'd be pretty scary if he wasn't. Of course, I found out he was more than good later on.
I'm sitting in the temple room, Prabhupada's sitting in the Vyasasan, he's being interviewed by the news media. The question is, what will happen to your movement when you die? Before the words were out of his mouth, it was so lightning quick. Prabhupada was saying, I will never die. Right back at the guy. And we're like, and then Prabhupada explained himself. I will live forever in my books.
This was in the middle of the Inconceivable Marathon, so Romeshwar had arranged that the BBT staff, they're on a special bus that arrives right before the Rath Yatra and takes off right after. So I remember I just would look at Prabhupada and kept staring at him and praying, how can I be of some service to you? Because I was feeling that I was just useless and missing out on all the nectar and not having anything to do for Lord Chaitanya's mission. Well, here I was, working on the book marathon, but still, those were my sentiments. And I was lost in the crowd and just looking up at Prabhupada and praying like that, very emphatically from my heart. And I'll never forget, all of a sudden, amidst hundreds upon hundreds of devotees, Prabhupada suddenly looked in my direction and looked straight at me. And I was so shocked. He just looked straight at me and fixed his eyes straight on me. I had no doubt what was going on. And I was like, just stunned, like, my God, he actually hears, he actually knows what's going on in my heart.
Jayananda had said these wheels of the chariots are all wearing out, and they're dangerous, and they're too big, and they're too heavy, and we need to replace them. He wanted to make steel wheels with spokes. So he had this welder making new wheels. And the night before the Rath Yatra, we went and put new wheels on Jagannath's chariot and Balaram's chariot, not on Subhadra's chariot. Her chariot was relatively easy to navigate compared to the other two. So we pulled the chariots, testing the new wheels, and there was no problem. The next morning, of course, the parade starts, and as soon as we started pulling the chariots, these new wheels collapsed. Instead of being round, they became octagons. Between each spoke, steel collapsed. So the chariots were bouncing, and I was horrified because the vibration was so intense. Fortunately, Srila Prabhupada was on Subhadra's cart. But what was remarkable is that I had written Srila Prabhupada and told him that we were making new wheels. And he had written me back and said, the old wheels are fine. Don't change anything. This is your American disease. But by the time he'd gotten the letter, the old wheels had already been thrown away and the new wheels were done. So Jayananda reassured me, he said, no, there's no problem. But then it was like Prabhupada's words had to be fulfilled. So as soon as that parade started, the new wheels collapsed. And I could hear Prabhupada's voice say, stick with the old way.
The other thing that I remember is, upon arrival at the festival site, Radha Ballabha, who was in charge of the production at that point, brought Prabhupada a stack of books, which had just been printed, because this was during the Inconceivable Marathon, so some books had already started to come out. And Prabhupada took those books, and I'll just never forget what I saw. He was on the stage, seated on his Vyasasan, and I was down below, seated on the grass, and I saw Prabhupada just light up like the moon in the sky upon getting those books in his hand, and I'll never forget that. Then I remember him lecturing, and I remember him saying, I've given this example so many times. You water the tree at the root, all the branches blossom. You put the food in the mouth, the whole body's energized. I remember at that moment, I finally caught it. It finally dawned on me, the utter simplicity yet profundity of Krishna consciousness in Bhakti Yoga. Simply by satisfying Krishna, all purposes are fulfilled.
On the way down from L.A. to San Diego, Jayatirtha was falling asleep driving, so Prabhupada wouldn't let him drive anymore. So Jayatirtha got me to drive him a 1-hour drive, but of course in those days, none of us slept much. So I remember I'm driving, I'm about halfway down. I look in the back, Prabhupada, his head tilted back, and he was asleep. A few minutes later, I think it was Brahmananda sitting beside him, and he was asleep. Jayatirtha sitting shotgun, I looked over at him. A few minutes later, he was asleep. And I was like going through all these things to keep my eyes open. And I was like pinching myself and doing all this stuff. I was falling asleep with my eyes open. And all of a sudden, I hear this. And Prabhupada starts the kirtan. And then gradually, all the others woke up in the car, and we had this really nice kirtan, 4 of us in the car. He led the kirtan.
Srila Prabhupada went on a tour of the temple, and I walked with him, and he, of course, went to the temple room first and offered his obeisances. I never forget, he walked in every room. He was inspecting everywhere. And the last room he went in was the Sankirtan room where all of his books were stored. And when he saw his books were being taken care of and respected, he was so pleased. He grabbed me in his arms and embraced me, and he said, "Thank you very much, thank you very much." And I fell at his feet offering dandavats and said, "Thank you, Srila Prabhupada." That was the fulfillment of all desires, to see Srila Prabhupada smile at me.
San Diego is a beautiful place where the sun always shines. They had a very large poster that used to be displayed in Los Angeles, a billboard showing a man on the golf course with the green grass and the blue sky. The caption was, "Just another beautiful day in San Diego." So that's San Diego, a place where it's perpetually beautiful and the people are perpetually mellow and life is perpetually wonderful. And Prabhupada arrives on a beautiful summer day to address the people who had gathered for the Hare Krishna festival in Balboa Park. And they're basking in the sun, and there's these young demigods with bronze chests and beautiful blonde hair hanging down from their aristocratic, beautiful faces. And Prabhupada gives this lecture about this rotten material body. And it was just so perfect. It was just a dart in the hearts of these conditioned souls misidentifying themselves with the material nature.
Prabhupada was starting off speaking about one subject, and then a hippie interrupted him. "I want sex!" And Prabhupada just changed the whole subject of the lecture and began to explain in detail the Grihastha regular principles for having children. It's quite astonishing. Telling the hippie, "You can have, but this is the way you have it." Then after he spoke, there was this wonderful kirtan.
There's Govardhan. He's the temple president. And I'd actually just taken initiation in June. So this is like a month later. I was actually here when Prabhupada came in, but I'm not here because I'm out at the curb with the car. And we had a nice white Lincoln Continental that we got from Ford Motor Company. We filled it with marigolds. I mean, it was just chock-a-block full with marigolds. And then when Srila Prabhupada came out, I offered my obeisances to him and held the door open, and he gave me a nice pat on the shoulder. I always remember that, and got in, and we took off for the temple. I was Srila Prabhupada's driver for his whole visit in Detroit. When you drive from the airport into the city, you pass Ford Motor Company is on both sides of the road as you're coming in, and there's actually this big tire that's been there for years. It came from the World's Fair, I think. In 1964, they had a World's Fair, and they had a Goodyear exhibit, so they brought this huge tire. So we're passing this big, huge tire, and Prabhupada says, Srila Prabhupada had a great sense of humor. He said, oh, this is the presiding deity of Detroit. And then we drove a little farther, and here's the car here. There I am. So we drove a little farther, and we passed Ford Motor Company on the left, and on the right, world headquarters, Ford Motor Company, it said. So Brahmananda said, is this where you work? And Prabhupada said, in his very deep voice, he said, no, he is the proprietor. So we all had a good laugh at that. And then we proceeded on to the temple. We were still at the temple on Jefferson. Temple on Jefferson is in a historic neighborhood, Indian Village it's called. And we would go out to Belle Isle to go for a morning walk. It's a park near the temple on Jefferson, so we would go out there and park and then walk around. And it was my job to find the proper route. And no matter what route I ever came up with, we'd always run into a bunch of rowdy people or something. It was just, because it's a city park, so the caliber of people in there were not so great. There'd be some people that had been there all night, come rolling out of the bushes. But Prabhupada was very merciful, and I think he enjoyed walking there. The devotees had built Prabhupada a palanquin because the temple room was on the 3rd floor. So they had built a palanquin to carry Prabhupada up to the top. And he took one look at it and waved his hand and said, no, because it didn't look very, very safe. We would come back to the temple room for greeting of the deities. And there's Radha Kunja Bihari Jai. Govardhan was such a perfectionist that, they were never ready by the time we got back. So, we'd be standing out in front of the curtain with Prabhupada. I could hear Govardhan screaming in the back, forget it. Just get the curtain open on time. But he always did such a nice job dressing the deities. I think Radha Kunja Bihari were famous for their opulence and also the opulent prasadam and milk sweets that you got. We used to just steal the Mangalarati sweets after Mangalarati and go into Govardhan's office and eat them.
Prabhupada came to greet the deities, and he sat on the Vyasasan, and nobody was doing Guru Puja. And I had never done Guru Puja before for Srila Prabhupada, and I'm not the type of person that jumps in on things. I always tend to let other people do it. But I was right next to the Vyasasan, so Brahmananda just came and kind of pushed me over to the arti tray. So that was the first and last time I was able to offer Guru Puja for Prabhupada. But the experience I had was that it was like there was no puja going on and Prabhupada was sitting in a room by himself. There were probably close to 200 devotees in the kirtan, glorifying Prabhupada. And I was worshiping him. But the way Prabhupada was taking it was as if none of that was going on. I didn't see any, what we could say, relish of being in that position, or any kind of desire or inclination to take advantage of that position. It was as if nothing was going on in the room. I was doing the puja, He was looking, he would look around, kind of observe what's going on with the devotees, more that he was looking after them. And this glorification is going on, and he's just taking it in for our benefit.
Summer of '75, we were on one of the Radha Damodar buses. Adi Keshava was the head of the bus, and we decided to follow Prabhupada around as much as we could. So we came to Detroit. The temple room was up in the attic. We converted the attic to a temple. Avi Ram, myself, some other devotees. Nobody knew how to do drywall taping at the time. So we had put all this drywall up, and when we were trying to figure out what to do, a young man showed up. And what do you do? Oh, I do drywall taping. So he stayed, taped the whole temple room, stayed when Prabhupada came, and then left, just like that. Krishna sent someone to help us out. Some gentleman had come to see Prabhupada, and he was someone who knew all the big auto barons and the history of Detroit, and he discussed that with Prabhupada. And he seemed to be very happy just to meet, a great personality like Prabhupada. Prabhupada didn't preach to him, just listened to what he said. It's very cordial. I was sitting in the room, Acharya, and I thought Prabhupada was supposed to preach to everybody. But Prabhupada didn't preach to him at all. Prabhupada was just very nice and cordial, listened, asked a few questions. And I realized later that Prabhupada's a good judge of time and circumstance. This person wasn't into anything about spiritual life. He just liked to meet great people, famous people. And he came and met Prabhupada, the most famous person.
We did some programs also at the University of Michigan. Because I was a driver, I wanted to get Prabhupada as close to the door as I could. So one time I drove through these bushes and over the grass and everything to get Srila Prabhupada to the door of the auditorium. Brahmananda was sitting in the back. He's saying, "You can't do that just because you're a Ford." And I said, "No, it's not because of that." I said, "Because I have Prabhupada in the back seat. I feel I can bend the rules a little bit to try to get him as close to the door as possible." Prabhupada was laughing. He thought it was funny. But we had some nice programs at University of Michigan. And Prabhupada was just on his world tour. But at the same time, we were getting ready to buy a new temple. And Govardhan had gone out and scouted around and had found what is now the Bhaktivedanta Cultural Center. This historic mansion, the Fisher Mansion, which was in this very, very dilapidated part of town. East Jefferson, it's called. And it was, ghetto and just horrible. But the property itself was quite nice, and it was being sold. So we took Srila Prabhupada over there. The man who owned it owned an alarm company, so he had rigged the whole house up to test his alarms, and he had dogs and carpeting, and it was really moochy. So I was not all that impressed because it was dark and oppressive, and it was just scary. It was a scary place. And, I was not all that impressed by it. But we walked into the ballroom that Mr. Fisher used to have his parties in. And at the far end of the ballroom were 3 arches behind which the orchestra used to sit to play for the people when they came to the dance. So Srila Prabhupada saw these 3 arches and he said, "Oh, Krishna has made this house for us." So we all walked around and looked at the mansion here, there. And, Prabhupada asked what they were asking, and, they were asking $350,000. And Srila Prabhupada said, "Just to us, not to the realtor. Every room is worth $350,000. And then as we were walking out, Govardhan said, "How do you like this house, Srila Prabhupada?" And Prabhupada said, "Who would not like?" So Govardhan, I don't know why he said, "Well, Ambarish doesn't like it," because I expressed some reservations about it. I was a new devotee, and I said, "Prabhupada, it's like Maya. When you're new, you think you know a lot more than you actually do." So Prabhupada said, "Yes, Krishna is Maya too. This can be utilized for Krishna's service too." Prabhupada saw everything as being able to be utilized in Krishna's service as principle of Yukta Vairagya, which I didn't know very much about then. Also, Prabhupada said if Krishna comes here, the neighborhood would change, because I had expressed some reservations. This is a high crime neighborhood. Actually, the first carjacking in the United States took place there. So I had some reservations about crime and what was going to happen to the devotees, etc. And Prabhupada said, you just bring Krishna here and distribute prasadam, then everything will change. I just surrendered. So we decided we would make an offer for the house. So the next day, Govardhan, myself, and Srila Prabhupada, we went back to the house, back to the Fisher Mansion, and we had a meeting out by the pool with the real estate lady, our broker, and the owner of the house. We all sat down, and the first thing that Srila Prabhupada said was, we are mendicants, so we would like it if you would give us this house. So the real estate lady, she almost fell in the pool, and because she saw her commission fly out the window. And, the owner of the house, his jaw dropped, because I could tell what was going on in his head, that he was looking at Prabhupada and thinking, well, maybe he's a mendicant, but this guy over here looking at me, we definitely know he's not a mendicant, because he knew who I was. So anyway, he said, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that. And so he was asking $350,000, and Srila Prabhupada agreed to pay $300,000. So we got this beautiful historic mansion with all this work that really can't be replicated. I mean, that house, to replace it, would cost probably $5–10 million. So we got it for $300,000, so everybody was happy. Lekha Shivanti, she was Walter Reuther's daughter, and she basically surrendered everything. She gave everything she had to buy this house, and whatever she couldn't cover, I covered, so it was about 50-50. She was very surrendered, and I really commend her for that, because she sacrificed everything for Prabhupada. That night, I remember the real estate lady, she was a middle-aged Polish woman, and her friend came over to kind of congratulate Prabhupada that they'd accepted the offer. So they came up to Prabhupada's room. Both of them were intoxicated. So they were kind of rolling around on the pillows in front of Prabhupada's desk. But he was so jolly, because he was happy that we had purchased this house. And he was so kind to these old ladies. That was Prabhupada's nature, was that he could see everybody's spiritual identity, and he was very merciful to them. So we ended up purchasing the house, and that was a momentous occasion during that trip. We had our grand opening in 1983, I think it was. And since that time, there's been redevelopment all around the whole mansion, and people have told us, actually, that the reason that they came in there and put money into the area was because the Fisher Mansion was there and was being maintained so nicely by the devotees. So Srila Prabhupada could see past, present, and future, and could see that this was going to be very successful and become a very famous place. But it was really wonderful to have Prabhupada there. I remember it very sweetly. And of course, I had my personal service driving Prabhupada around. It was very nice, just after having been initiated. I'll always remember that trip.
Prabhupada spoke, then Prabhupada went to the airport, and we all went to the airport with Prabhupada. And I decided I had to get close to Prabhupada, and I had to get a glimpse or something from Prabhupada. So many devotees were there, and Prabhupada was walking through the corridors up to the lounge where he would take his flight from. And I remember I pushed my way through the devotees, and I came right up next to Prabhupada, and I was thinking, now here I am, the most fortunate person in the world. I'm walking next to Prabhupada. And I remember just so casually he turned and he looked at me, and he just gave me this look that turned me into dust. It was just like, it wasn't any special effort for him, but he just looked at me, and the way he looked at me, it made me realize that I was really, really nothing, And then something interesting happened. This one non-devotee gentleman, he pushed his way right through the crowd, and he pushed himself right up in front of Prabhupada. More or less, he just stood right in Prabhupada's path. And he looked up and he said, "Swami, I've got a question for you." And Prabhupada smiled very charmingly, and he said, "What's your question?" And the man said, "If I were to give you $1 million right now, what would you do?" And Prabhupada smiled, and he said, "Oh, that's a very easy question." He said, "I would print books, and I would build beautiful temples for Krishna." And then the man just said, "Thank you very much, Swami." He turned and he walked off.
शरीरं जय जगदीश हरे जय जगदीश हरे जय जगदीश हरे.
Prabhupada was always traveling economy class. So we got the bright idea that Prabhupada should travel first class. So we were going to